Hello and welcome back to the Financial Wealth and Health Podcast. My name is Isabel Rothy, a financial advisor at Desert Wealth Management, and it's my goal to help people work toward financial freedom by focusing on financial health. One of my favorite ways to describe different financial topics is by sharing the similarities between wealth and health. I truly believe that in order to become financially wealthy and financially free, you need to be financially healthy first. Let's grow our financial wealth and health together. In today's podcast episode, whether you're listening on the audio version or watching on the video version, we're going to be discussing what's going on with inflation and rising interest rates. These are two topics that are so prevalent in the news and the economy these days, and I wanted to create a video explaining the basics so that as you learn more about what's going on, you have a simple, basic understanding to go off of. As a brief disclaimer, this episode is not intended for financial advice. It's merely an educational resource to guide you in your financial life. And what I've noticed is there's a lot of articles, podcasts, videos, all about what's going on in the world. And there's a lot of financial jargon, a lot of financial terms that are used that I think it'd be kind of confusing when you're just trying to figure out what's going on. And so that's one of the reasons I wanted to create this episode, to really discuss the basics and share a little bit about some action steps that you can consider taking when trying to figure out how to handle inflation and rising interest rates. So I really hope you enjoy today's episode. Diving in, I want to chat about the definition of inflation. And I have my notes right over here, so if you see me looking back and forth here on the video podcast, that's why. But inflation means a rise in prices. Another way to think about it is it's a loss of purchasing power. A carton of eggs next year will cost a little bit more than a carton of eggs this year. And in some cases, it may cost a lot more, just like the inflation we've seen over the last couple of years. Inflation is the rising of prices, and we've seen since 2021 inflation go up and up and up. And personally, for my personal wallet, I am over it. So I know a lot of us have experienced inflation firsthand in our everyday lives, but we may not fully understand the history of inflation since 2020, as well as what the Federal Reserve is doing to combat inflation. So that's what we're going to be discussing today. Now, CPI, the Consumer Price Index, is one of the most common measures of inflation. According to the United States Bureau of Labor Statistics, as of July 12, 2023, and it says that Consumer Price Index is a measure of the average change over time in the prices paid by urban consumers for a market basket of consumer goods and services. So CPI is a measure of inflation, a measure of those prices going up. And when we look at the 20-year chart for the CPI, you could see here on the screen, according to, once again, the United States Bureau of Labor Statistics, it's sharing the 12-month percentage change consumer price index for the selected categories. And I chose on here all categories. Since 2003 all the way to 2023 now, as of June 2023, we could see that inflation rate is going up and down and up and down. But as of a recent CPI report, as of July 12, 2023, the recent CPI for June 2023 is 3%, which is so great because if we look at last year in June 2022, the rate was at 9.1%. But looking back at history, in March 2020, the CPI was at 1.5%, which is pretty low considering where we're at today or where we were at a year ago. And looking a little further, in May 2020, it was quite low at 0.1%. But then you could see that line increasing over here. In January 2020, it went up to 1.4%. In June of 2021, it went to 5.4%. And just like I mentioned, a year later, June 2022 was at 9.1%. And now in June 2023, it's at 3%. So you could see that there's been, since 2020, a large scale of what's been going on with inflation. And like I said, we've all felt it in our wallets. So that's a brief history of inflation. If you want to take a look at this chart online, I have the website linked here on the screen, but I also have it linked in the show notes and description box below. Everything I'm citing today is linked below so that you know where the sources are from and so you can check them out if you're interested. So that's really the trend of what's been going on with CPI. And you're probably wondering, okay, well, we know that inflation is going down, But why did it start in the first place? Why in 2021 did it start picking up? Now, there are a lot of reasons for why inflation has picked up over the last couple years, and some of them are actually kind of political, so I won't go into all of the reasons, but I will share two reasons why inflation has picked up. They are cost push inflation and demand pull inflation. These are some of the basics I want to share, but if you want to learn more about some of the other reasons inflation may have gone up, you could definitely research it. There's a lot of studies out there, but for now I'll be going into these two reasons. So let's define cost push inflation. Investopedia.com shared an article as of March 7th, 2022, and it describes cost push inflation in a really clear way, so I want to read this definition for you. This article says that cost push inflation, also known as wage push inflation, occurs when overall prices increase due to increases in the cost of wages and raw materials. Higher costs of production can decrease the aggregate supply, the amount of total production in the economy. Since the demand for goods hasn't changed, the price increases from production are passed on to consumers, creating cost push inflation. Now, this has to do a lot with supply chains. So let's go back to COVID-19 back in 2020. The whole world pretty much shut down. The supply chain got totally disrupted. And so even though people wanted to still buy items, demand for goods didn't change. For services it did, because we had to stay indoors and we couldn't do a lot of stuff. But our demand for goods stayed the same, and some argue that it increased a little since we, stayed at home. We still wanted to do online shopping. We had hobbies, but demand for goods didn't change much, but the supply side changed. So because of that, prices for those goods went up. There's a great article by the Harvard Business Review that explains cost push inflation. This article was written December 3rd of 2022, and a great quote from this article reads, "Inflation often happens because of supply shocks, major disruptions to an important economic input like energy. For example, if a lot of oil fields stop producing oil because of a war, the price of energy increases. Since energy is a critical input into almost every other good, prices of other things rise too." This is one example how the supply of an item, when it is reduced, can impact the price, because people still want oil, but there's less of it, so the price goes up. And we saw the impact of oil prices with the war between Russia and Ukraine throughout the past couple of years. There's another type of inflation called demand pull inflation. This also had an impact on one of the reasons why inflation has been increasing over the past couple of years. According to another Investopedia article as of May 28th, 2023, it shares that demand pull inflation causes upward pressure on prices due to shortages in supply, a condition that economists describe as too many dollars chasing too few goods. So let's go back to COVID-19. Instead of focusing as much on the supply right now, let's look at demand. In COVID-19, a lot of people, like we said, stayed home. They weren't spending as much money on travel and different services. They were still buying goods, but not as much on services. And then when we broke out of COVID-19, we could travel. We had actually higher savings rates. We had more money to spend. We wanted to go do stuff, but still the supply side was backed up a little bit. And as you remember, a lot of places were hiring workers. So even a lot of the services sectors still needed workers, and so they weren't able to supply as much. And then everything going on with travel, trying to figure out how to manage all that. So the demand was there. People had money they wanted to spend, but there just weren't as much goods and services to spend it on because the supply side was still backed up. Going back to that Harvard Business Review article that talked about cost push inflation, they also talk about demand pull inflation. And they quote a gentleman named David Moss, who wrote the book A Concise Guide to Macroeconomics, What Managers, Executives, and Students Need to Know. Now, I didn't read this book, but I wanted to share this person's name because he is quoted in the section of the Harvard Business Review article that I want to share. So this paragraph from the Harvard Business Review article shares, "Then there's the demand side of the equation. An increase in the money supply will tend to cause inflation, as Moss explains. With more cash in their pockets and bank accounts, consumers often find new reasons to buy things," he writes in the book. "But unless the supply of goods and services has increased in the meantime, the consumer's mounting demand for products will simply bid up prices, thus stoking inflation." So when we look at both the demand and the supply, everything that happened in COVID impacted inflation a lot and brought prices higher. Now, like I said, this is not the only reason that inflation went up, but it is a major part of it. So I wanted to explain it here. Now, if you have questions about any of these finance terms and want to talk more about the economy, you could send me a DM over on Instagram. You could send me an email at my email address, which is linked below in the show notes and description box, or you could schedule a free call with me to chat more. Either way, I know I just shared a lot of information, but it's important to know different parts of the economy so that you feel well informed with what's going on in the world and in your financial life. So, we know that inflation has gone up, and we've shared some of the reasons why it went up. However, let's talk about what's going on with inflation now. So according to the CPI report as of July 12, 2023, this is according to the United States Bureau of Labor Statistics, the Consumer Price Index for all urban consumers rose 0.2% in June on a seasonally adjusted basis after increasing 0.1% in May. 2023. The United States Bureau of Labor Statistics reported today, over the last 12 months, the All Items Index increased 3% before seasonal adjustment. And if you're watching here on the YouTube channel, you could see this graph online from June 2022 to June 2023, the individual rates for each month of the increase in the CPI. And we could see that June of 2023 is a lot lower than June 2022. Now, there's another chart I want to share. This is also still from the United States Bureau of Labor Statistics, still as of July 12, 2023. And this info is shown in a graph that is a different style to show how the blue line right here of all items has gone down over the past year, which we saw a few minutes ago in the video. So we've talked about the history of inflation over the last couple years. We talked about some of the reasons why it has increased, but you're probably wondering, okay, why is inflation now going down? One of the reasons is from actions taken by the Federal Reserve. Now, the Federal Reserve is the central bank of the United States. And one way that the Federal Reserve tries to reduce inflation is by increasing the federal funds rate. According to an Investopedia article as of May 4th, 2023, the term federal funds rate refers to the target interest rate range set by the Federal Open Market Committee, also known as FOMC. This target is the rate at which commercial banks borrow and lend their excess reserves to each other overnight. So when we're talking about the federal funds rate, we're talking about a range. So it's between 5 and 5.25 or 4.75 and 5. So it's a range. And you're probably wondering, okay, that's great. We're talking about the range. Since March of 2022, the Federal Reserve has been increasing this federal funds rate range. I do want to share a couple charts of the history of the Federal Reserve increasing rates since March of 2022. This graph is from the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve Board, and it shows since March of 2022 all the way since May of 2022, when we had our last increase in the federal funds rate range, the different ranges that have been increased over time. There's another graph according to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York that shows those incremental step-ups since March of 2022. I want to share how this affects you as someone who probably borrows money from the bank, whether through a car loan, whether it's through a mortgage, a credit card, or a different type of loan. How does it affect you? Well, NBC News shared this great article that described it, and I'm going to read some parts of this article. The article is as of June 16th, 2022, and it shares when you get a loan from a bank, for example, when you're buying a house, an interest rate is attached to that loan. The interest rate is the price you pay to borrow the money. Banks need to borrow money too. Instead of borrowing directly from other banks, they look to the Federal Reserve, America's central bank. Its primary role is to provide a safe and reliable financial system for the U.S. by maintaining deposit accounts for banks. Now, when banks need to borrow money, they look to other banks that have deposit accounts with the Fed that may be in a surplus. And just as with any other loan, the banks are charged an interest rate for borrowing money. It is this percentage, known as the federal funds rate, that the Federal Reserve helps set with its interest rate announcements. So you're probably wondering, okay, great, but how does that affect me? This article goes on to say, banks pass on the cost of a higher Federal Reserve funds rate to their customers when those customers want to access regular lending products. So you're probably wondering, okay, if the Federal Reserve is raising rates and it's affecting me as a borrower, how does that try to reduce inflation? All right, well, it makes it more expensive to borrow money, so consumers end up buying less items, thus demand goes down. So let's say you want to buy a car. Let's say a few years ago you wanted to buy a car and your interest rate was between 3 and 4%. You may be incentivized to buy that car because that interest rate isn't as high. But let's say you want to buy a car this year in 2023. The interest rate is probably a lot higher than it was a couple years ago, so you may be less incentivized to buy the car because your interest rate is higher, which will make your monthly payment higher. So we could see here that the demand for items, especially items that you may need to take a loan out to purchase, is going down because you don't want to spend as much money on the interest rate. So thus, when demand for the good goes down, the inflation and the prices of those goods ends up going down. And that's one of the reasons the Federal Reserve increases rates, is because they want to make it harder to borrow money. They want less money circulating around in the economy. So when the Federal Reserve increases rates, it discourages people from spending as much money. Now, there are a couple other reasons why inflation is going down. We won't get into that today. We're really just talking about the Federal Reserve raising interest rates and how that's affecting you as a borrower. But that's that relationship between supply and demand. Now, before we close off the episode today, I want to chat a little bit about how raising interest rates could be affecting the bonds in your portfolio. You may be watching this video and think, I don't really have any bond investments in my portfolio. Or you may be watching this and realize, I do have bonds in my portfolio, or I used to have more bond investments in my portfolio. When interest rates go up, bond prices go down. And when interest rates go down, bond prices go up. And I want to share an example of how this can, be affected in your portfolio, and why, if you're looking at your portfolio and you've noticed over the past couple years your bond portfolios haven't been doing so well, one of the reasons is because interest rates going up and bond prices going down. There's this article from Investopedia as of May 25th, 2023, and it says, the reason for this is actually quite straightforward. Say a bond with a $1,000 face value pays 5% interest annually, which is $50 per year, at a fixed interest rate. It is issued when prevailing interest rates are also 5%. But let's say that a year later, interest rates rise to 10%. A bond investor could now buy a new bond for $1,000 and be paid $100 per year for holding it. This means that the old bond, which pays only $50 per year, has to be worth less. So the only way somebody would buy the 5% bond would be at a discount in the market. So I really love this example, and it kind of shows the example of interest rates increasing. Let's say that 5% bond was issued in 2022, and then let's say in 2023 there is a bond issued at new interest rates. Let's say it's at 10%. Investors would want to purchase that 10% bond more than that 5% interest rate bond because it's giving them a higher interest payment. So thus the bond with the lower interest rate would have to sell at a discount in price. So just by looking at this simple example, you can see how inflation has affected interest rates, which could have affected the bonds in your portfolio. So now that we've talked about the economy, taking a look specifically at inflation and raising interest rates, you may wonder, okay, well, where do I go from here? Now, this video is not specific advice. I do not know your situation well enough to give you specific advice. But if you're trying to figure out some ideas on action steps to take, I have a couple ideas for you to consider. Number one is to have a plan set in place. If you want to save for retirement, for example, figure out how much you want to spend in retirement, and then backtrack to figure out how much you should be saving now for retirement in the future. And then from there, you could figure out how much you could spend on fun items now, so you could both live in the present and prepare for the future. So having a plan in place, whether it's for that goal of retirement or for that goal of buying a house or paying off debt or saving for your future children's education, whatever your financial goal is, develop a plan to figure out your savings goal now, and then from there you could figure out how much you could spend every month. A lot of people get caught up in cash flow. They end up spending too much and then not having enough money every month to save. But I think it's a really good idea to consider to calculate first how much you need to save, and then after that you could figure out what you have left to spend. But having a good plan like that can help you feel like you're in control in a time in the world where a lot of things are out of our control. But what we can control is how much we save and how much we spend. Another idea on an action step you can consider taking if it lines up with your financial life is creating a joy-based budget. For example, when we're looking at that fun money left over every month of what we could spend on fun items, take a look at previous months and look at what you spend your money on and figure out if you're satisfied with those purchases. Some people love spending money on going out to eat. Some people love spending money on traveling. Some people love spending money on self-care, on makeup, on skincare. Some people like to spend money on tech items or new devices or outdoor type of supplies for camping or other trips like that. People love to spend money on different fun things, but if you're spending your money, your fun money that you get to spend after you've saved, if you're spending that money on things that don't bring you joy, then you're probably going to feel burnt out, especially with inflation going on in the world. Everything is costing more money, so you want to make sure your hard-earned money that you're spending on expensive fun items is worth it to you. So take a look at your fun money budget and reallocate it to have more joy in your budget. I think that'll really give you a positive to focus on, especially with everything going on in the world. And then a third idea of an action step you can consider taking if it lines up with your financial life is have an assessment on your investments and see if they line up with your goals. When you look at your financial goals, I challenge you to put them in 3 different buckets: a short-term, mid-term, and long-term bucket. For your short-term bucket, earmark that for 1 to 3 years. For the mid-term bucket, have that be 4 to 10 years, and your long-term bucket, have it be 11 plus years. Then take your different financial goals: buying a house, paying off debt, retiring, saving up enough money to start a business, whatever it is, and put it in those different buckets. Do you want to work toward accomplishing this goal in 5 years or 7 years or 2 years or 6 months? Put it in those buckets. And then take a look at your investments and see if they align with those buckets. For the goals that are more on the short-term side, between 1 and 3 years, it's probably a good idea to consider putting those in more of a liquid type of account, a savings account or a high yield savings account. But for the midterm goals and the long-term goals, you may want to consider putting those into investment accounts because they have more time to grow. Now, of course, the midterm bucket should probably be allocated a little less aggressive on the investment side than the long-term bucket because you have less time in the market. But if you have a goal where you want to buy a house in 5 years and it's not invested that aggressively, if it's super conservative, you may want to consider making the investments a little bit more on the growth side. But let's say that account to buy a house in a few years is super aggressive. Well, you may want to reallocate it to make it a little less aggressive. Of course, though, this is not investment advice. This is general education and information, so don't take this as advice. But the main point of this is to take a look at each of your investment goals, line them up with different buckets that have different timelines, and then assess if the risk tolerance, if the investments in that portfolio, if the risk of those investments line up with those timelines. So often I see people have different goals, different investments, different timelines, and the risk level of their investments is not lined up. So I encourage you to do an assessment of your investments and see if they line up with your goals. So that way your goals are guiding your investment strategy rather than letting your emotions guide your investment strategy. But of course, if you want specific advice about your investments and some action steps, please reach out to me and we could see if it's a good idea for us to work together. If you like this type of episode about different economic updates, please let me know. And if you have any other episode ideas for me to speak on, send them to me to either my email or my Instagram DM inbox. I'd love to hear from you. And on that note, if you have any questions at all, you know where to contact me. All of it is linked in the show notes and description box below. Thank you so much for your time today. I look forward to chatting with you more in the next episode. And let's stay financially wealthy and healthy together. The opinions voiced in this show are for general information only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual. To determine which strategies or investments may be suitable for you, consult the appropriate qualified professional prior to making a decision. All investing involves risk, including loss of principal. No strategy assures success or protects against loss.